Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The Caruso estate sat on 12 acres of prime real estate at the edge of town, a sprawling Mediterranean villa that looked like it had been lifted from the Italian countryside and dropped into rural Pennsylvania. Iron gates marked the entrance, flanked by stone lions that had watched over 3 generations of the family. The driveway wound through manicured gardens, past a fountain that cost more than most houses in town, up to a mansion that somehow managed to feel both welcoming and warning at the same time. This wasn't just a home. This was a fortress dressed in flower beds. Every important family in town had received an invitation to little Sophia Caruso's 5th birthday party. The mayor and his wife, the police chief and his teenage sons, business owners who paid their respects in monthly envelopes, lawyers who knew which questions not to ask, doctors who understood that some injuries didn't need official reports. They gathered on the back lawn with champagne flutes and carefully rehearsed smiles, watching their children play on equipment that cost more than their annual salaries. Everyone knew the rules. You arrived on time. You brought appropriate gifts. You made pleasant conversation about weather and sports and absolutely nothing else. You complimented Elena Caruso's garden. You told Dominic his granddaughter was beautiful. You ate the catered food and drank the expensive wine, and you never, ever forgot where you were standing. These weren't suggestions. They were survival instincts passed down through decades of careful observation. Dominic Caruso had built his empire the old way, through loyalty and fear in equal measure. His father had started with a single trucking company. His grandfather before that had run numbers during Prohibition. Now the Caruso family controlled shipping routes, construction contracts, and enough local politicians to ensure that certain questions were never asked and certain investigations never went anywhere. But Dominic was different from the men who came before him. His father had been cruel for sport. His grandfather had been paranoid to the point of madness. Dominic was something else entirely, methodical, calculated, fair in his own way. He honored agreements. He punished betrayal. He protected those who showed loyalty and eliminated those who didn't with the same calm efficiency. His men respected him because he was consistent. His enemies feared him because he was patient. And the people of this town, the ones who existed in the gray space between, they understood one fundamental truth about Dominic Caruso. He had lines that could not be crossed. No one knew exactly where all those lines were drawn, but everyone had heard the stories about what happened when someone found one. The contractor who skimmed from a building fund and was never seen again. The politician who tried to double-cross a deal and found his career destroyed overnight. The man from out of town who had made the mistake of threatening Dominic's daughter 20 years ago. That man's name had been erased from every record. His family had moved away within a week, and no one spoke of what happened in between. So when a 6-year-old girl in a faded dress walked across that perfectly manicured lawn and grabbed Dominic Caruso's sleeve, every adult in that garden held their breath. This wasn't how things worked. Children didn't approach him uninvited. Strangers didn't touch him without permission. Problems were handled through proper channels, through intermediaries and carefully worded requests, and the slow machinery of favors owed and debts collected. But this little girl either didn't know the rules or had decided they didn't apply to her. Her name was Lily Brennan. She was 6 years old, and she had walked 2 miles through town to find the one person everyone said could fix anything. The party guests watched in frozen silence as Dominic looked down at the small hand clutching his expensive jacket. His security team had already noticed the breach. Two men in dark suits were moving through the crowd, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Elena Caruso had gathered their granddaughter and was walking briskly toward the house. The other children had stopped playing, sensing something wrong in the way adults sense earthquakes before they hit. But Dominic didn't signal for his men to intervene. He didn't brush the girl away. Instead, he did something that made every person in that garden question everything they thought they knew about the most dangerous man in town. He knelt down. His massive frame folded slowly, expensive suit pants pressing into grass that groundskeepers maintained with obsessive precision. He brought himself to her eye level, his face now inches from hers, close enough to see the dried tear tracks on her cheeks and the purple shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than anyone had ever heard it. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily." Her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Lily Brennan." Something shifted in Dominic Caruso's face. The guests were too far away to see it clearly, but those closest would later describe it as recognition. Not of the girl herself, but of something in her eyes. Something he hadn't seen in decades but remembered like it was yesterday. Fear. Desperate, bone-deep fear. The kind that makes children old before their time. "Tell me what's happening, Lily." His voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Tell me everything." And she did. The words tumbled out in a rush, punctuated by hiccups and half-swallowed sobs. She told him about Marcus, about the hitting, about hiding in the closet while her mother screamed, about the night she thought her mama had died because she went so quiet and wouldn't wake up, no matter how hard Lily shook her. She told him about calling 911 once, and what happened after. How Marcus had found out. How he'd hurt her mother worse that time. Said it was Lily's fault for trying to get help. How she'd learned to stay quiet and stay small and stay invisible because that was the only way to survive. She told him that she'd heard people at the diner talking about Dominic Caruso, how they said he could do anything, how they said even the police were scared of him, how she'd looked up his address in her mother's old phone book and walked here because she didn't know where else to go. And then she said the words that would echo in Dominic's mind for the rest of his life. "You're the only one people are scared of, so maybe he'll be scared of you too. Maybe you can make him stop." The garden remained absolutely silent. 50 adults stood motionless, champagne going flat, children forgotten, social masks crumbling in the face of something they couldn't process. A child had walked into their carefully maintained illusion and torn it apart with nothing but the truth. Dominic Caruso's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. His hands, which had ordered unspeakable things, reached out and gently took Lily's small fingers in his. "Do you know who your mama's boyfriend is?" His voice was still soft, but those closest could hear something dangerous building underneath. "Do you know his name?" Lily nodded. "Marcus. Marcus Webb. He works for a construction company. The temperature in that garden dropped 10 degrees. Marcus Webb. Dominic knew that name. Knew it because it appeared on his payroll every 2 weeks. Knew it because the man wore Caruso Construction on his back every time he showed up to a job site. Knew it because Marcus Webb was one of his employees, which meant that everything this child had just described had happened under his protection, in his territory, while wearing his name. Dominic stood slowly. His eyes swept across the gathered crowd, and every adult who met his gaze looked away. The mayor suddenly needed to check his phone. The police chief developed an intense interest in his shoes. The other guests scattered like birds sensing a predator. But Dominic wasn't looking at them. He was looking for his wife, who had already emerged from the house with their granddaughter safely inside. Elena's face carried the same understanding it always did when business interrupted family. She crossed the lawn and took Lily's hand without needing to be asked. "Come with me, sweetheart." Elena's voice was warm, practiced in the art of comfort. "Let's get you something to eat while the men talk." Lily looked up at Dominic with those exhausted eyes. "Are you going to help my mama?" Dominic Caruso didn't make promises lightly. In his world, a promise was a contract written in blood, binding and unbreakable. He had built his reputation on keeping every promise he made, no matter the cost. He looked at this broken little girl who had walked through his gates and shattered his afternoon, and reminded him of things he had spent 40 years trying to forget. "I'm going to help your mama," he said, "and I'm going to make sure no one ever hurts either of you again." Lily's face crumpled with relief. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. But these were different. These were the tears of someone who had finally found solid ground after drowning for months. Elena led her away toward the house. Dominic watched them go, his face unreadable. Then he turned to face his men, and every person still remaining in that garden saw the transformation happen in real time. The gentle man who had knelt before a crying child vanished. In his place stood something else entirely, something cold and focused and infinitely more dangerous than the crime boss they thought they knew. Sal. His voice carried across the lawn without rising above a conversational tone. "Tony. With me. Now." His two most trusted lieutenants materialized from the crowd, their faces carefully blank. "The party's over," Dominic said quietly. "Get everyone out, then find Marcus Webb. I don't care where he is or what he's doing. Find him. Watch him. Don't let him out of your sight." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "And call Dr. Antonelli. Tell him I need him at the house tonight. Tell him to bring everything he needs for a full examination. Tell him it's a child." His jaw tightened around the word. "And her mother." His men nodded and disappeared into the crowd, which was already beginning its awkward exodus. Cars would start soon. Gates would open. Within an hour, the Caruso estate would return to its normal silence. But nothing about this day was normal. Dominic stood alone in his garden, surrounded by the debris of his granddaughter's birthday party, and felt something crack open in his chest that he thought he had sealed shut decades ago. He knew what he was about to do. He knew the methods he would use and the questions he would ask, and the fate that awaited Marcus Webb at the end of this day. But that wasn't what made his hands tremble. What made his hands tremble was the memory of another child, 40 years ago, hiding in another closet, listening to another mother scream. That child had been him, and he had made a promise then too, a promise that no one would ever break again. You see, Dominic Caruso hadn't always been the untouchable patriarch that this town feared and obeyed. Once upon a time, he had been something else entirely. A boy named Nicky who flinched at loud noises. A son who learned to read his father's moods like weather patterns, knowing that the wrong word at the wrong moment could bring down storms that lasted for days. His father, Antonio Caruso, had been a violent man. Not the calculated violence that Dominic would later master, but something rawer and uglier, a drunk's violence. Unpredictable and senseless, and aimed at whoever happened to be closest when the rage took hold. Most nights, that was Dominic's mother. Her name was Maria. She had been beautiful once, before the bruises became permanent features and the light in her eyes dimmed to something that barely qualified as survival. She worked in the kitchen of her own home like a servant, cooking meals that were never good enough, cleaning rooms that were never clean enough, apologizing for sins she had never committed. Young Dominic had learned early that his job was to protect his little sister. Lucia was 4 years younger, small and delicate and terrified of everything. When their father's voice started rising, when the bottles started emptying, Dominic would take her hand and lead her to the hallway closet. He'd close the door and hold her against his chest and cover her ears so she wouldn't have to hear what came next. But he heard everything. The sound of his mother begging, the crash of furniture, the wet thud of fists on flesh, the silence that always followed, broken only by quiet sobbing and the heavy footsteps of a monster heading to bed. Dominic was 12 years old when everything changed. It was a Tuesday night in November. His father had lost money on a bet, which meant he'd been drinking since noon. By dinner time, he was looking for something to hurt. Maria had burned the roast. An accident, a small thing. The kind of mistake that happened in kitchens everywhere, every day, without consequence. In the Caruso house, there was no such thing as a small mistake. Antonio had grabbed Maria by the hair and dragged her across the kitchen floor. He'd slammed her head into the cabinet once, twice, 3 times. Blood had sprayed across the white tile. Lucia had started screaming from the hallway, and young Dominic had stood frozen by the refrigerator, watching his mother's eyes roll back in her head, watching the life drain out of her face. Something broke inside him that night. Not the breaking that makes you weak, the other kind. The kind that burns away everything soft and leaves behind something harder than diamond. Dominic walked to the kitchen drawer. He pulled out the biggest knife he could find, and he walked back to where his father was still standing over his mother's crumpled body. "Touch her again, and I'll kill you." His voice hadn't shaken. His hands hadn't trembled. He was 12 years old and barely came up to his father's chest. But in that moment, Antonio Caruso looked into his son's eyes and saw something that made him step backward. He saw a monster being born. Antonio left that night, packed a bag, and drove away without a word. The police found his car 3 states away 2 weeks later, abandoned in a parking lot. No one ever saw him again. The official story was that he'd run off to escape gambling debts. The unofficial story, whispered in certain circles, was something else entirely. Dominic never spoke of what happened, not even to his mother, who spent 6 weeks in the hospital, recovering from her injuries. Not even to Lucia, who had nightmares for years afterward. He buried that night so deep that sometimes he could almost convince himself it had happened to someone else. But he made 2 promises in the years that followed. First, he would build enough power that no one could ever threaten his family again. He would become so feared that the very thought of crossing him would be enough to keep the people he loved safe. Second, no woman or child would suffer in his territory while he had the power to stop it. The violence he dealt would be measured and purposeful. The pain he caused would be reserved for those who deserved it. And any man who raised his hand against the innocent would learn exactly what happened when a monster met someone more monstrous still. For 40 years, he had kept both promises. He had built his empire. He had protected his family. He had handled problems quietly and efficiently, making abusers disappear in ways that left no evidence and many whispers. The town knew, even if they never spoke of it. Hurt a child in Caruso territory, and you answered to Dominic himself. 6 times over the decades, he had delivered that answer personally. 6 men who had made the same mistake Marcus Webb was about to make. 6 graves that no one would ever find. But none of those situations had hit this close. None of those children had looked at him with Lily Brennan's eyes. None of them had grabbed his sleeve at his granddaughter's birthday party and said the exact words that his sister had whispered to him all those years ago. Please make him stop. Dominic stood in his empty garden as the last car pulled away from his gates. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that looked too beautiful for a day like this. Somewhere in his house, his wife was feeding a traumatized child and pretending everything was normal. Somewhere in this town, Marcus Webb was going about his evening without any idea that his life had just ended. Not his literal life. Not yet. That would come later, after Dominic had extracted every piece of information he needed. After he understood the full scope of what had happened. After he had made Marcus feel exactly what Rachel and Lily had felt, multiplied by every day of suffering he had caused. No, what had ended was everything else. Marcus Webb's job, his freedom, his ability to ever hurt another human being, his existence in any form that resembled a normal life. Dominic pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. Sal answered on the first ring. Boss, tell me, we found him. Maloney's bar, like you figured. He's been there since 4, running his mouth about how his girlfriend took off and how he's going to find her. Tony's got eyes on him. Has he threatened anyone else? Not yet, but he's drinking hard. Keeps talking about how she'll be sorry, how she can't hide forever. Dominic's grip tightened on the phone. Good. Let him keep talking. Let him make promises in front of witnesses. By tomorrow, there won't be a single person in this town who doesn't know what he is. And then what, boss? Then I'm going to have a conversation with him. A long one. There was a pause on the line. Sal had worked for Dominic for 23 years. He knew what that tone meant. Understood, he said quietly. We'll keep him contained. Dominic ended the call and looked up at his house, where warm light spilled from the windows and his wife was doing what she had always done best, protecting the innocent while he dealt with the guilty. But before he dealt with Marcus Webb, there was something else he needed to do. He needed to hear everything, every detail of what that man had done, every bruise he had caused. Every night he had made a little girl hide in a closet and listen to her mother beg for mercy. He needed to understand exactly how much pain Marcus Webb had earned. And then he would deliver it, personally, with interest. The back door opened, and Elena appeared on the porch. Her face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that told Dominic she had heard at least part of Lily's story. She's asking for you, Elena said softly. She wants to tell you the rest. She says there's more you need to know. Dominic nodded and walked toward his house. Somewhere in this town, Marcus Webb was drinking his last free drinks and making his last threats. He had no idea that a storm was coming. A storm in the shape of a man he had never met. A man who had once been a boy in a closet. A man who had spent 40 years waiting for a reason to remember exactly what he was capable of. Marcus Webb was about to find out. Inside the Caruso mansion, the contrast between the elegant surroundings and the broken child sitting in them was almost too painful to process. Lily perched on a leather chair that dwarfed her small frame, a plate of untouched cookies on the table beside her, and a glass of milk she hadn't touched. Elena sat nearby, her presence a quiet comfort, but her eyes kept drifting to her husband with questions she knew better than to ask out loud. Dominic pulled a chair close to Lily and sat down heavily. The leather creaked under his weight. Up close, he could see details he'd missed in the garden. The faded bruise on her left arm, half hidden by her sleeve. The way she held herself slightly crooked, favoring her right side. The nervous flutter of her hands, never quite still, always ready to protect her face. He had seen those movements before, in his sister, in his mother, in his own reflection 40 years ago. "Lily," he said gently, "you were very brave today. What you did took more courage than most adults have in their whole lives." Her eyes dropped to her lap. "I was scared you would be mad." "Mad?" He shook his head slowly. "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart. Not even a little bit. You did exactly the right thing. Mama always says we're not supposed to bother important people, that we should handle our own problems. Your mama sounds like a strong woman." Lily nodded, and fresh tears welled in her eyes. "She's the strongest person I know. But Marcus is stronger, and he keeps hurting her, and she can't make him stop, and neither can I, and—" Her voice broke. Dominic reached out and took her hand, his massive palm engulfing her tiny fingers. "Listen to me very carefully, Lily." He waited until she looked up at him. "What's happening to you and your mama is not your fault. None of it. Not one single piece. Do you understand? But I tried to call the police and That wasn't your fault either. That was a brave thing to do. Marcus punishing your mama for your bravery is his fault. Only his." Lily stared at him with eyes that had seen too much. "You really believe that?" "I know that." Dominic squeezed her hand gently. "I need you to tell me everything, Lily. Everything that's happened since Marcus came to live with you. Can you do that?" She nodded slowly, and then, in a voice that was far too steady for a 6-year-old, she began to tell him. The story that emerged was worse than what Dominic had heard in the garden. Much worse. Marcus Webb had moved in with Rachel Brennan 8 months ago. The first few weeks had been good. Presents for Lily, flowers for Rachel, promises of a better life, a real family, someone to help carry the weight that single mothers carried alone. Then the drinking started, then the jealousy, then the control. Marcus had convinced Rachel to quit her second job so she could spend more time at home. Then he'd taken over the finances because he was better with money. Then he'd started monitoring her phone, her movements, her friendships. Within 2 months, Rachel Brennan had been completely isolated. No money of her own, no car she could use, no friends left who hadn't been driven away by Marcus's constant presence and barely veiled threats. The hitting started in month 3. Lily described it with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to separate herself from her own experiences. A slap here, a shove there. Bruises that Rachel explained away with stories about clumsiness and accidents that never quite made sense. Then the hitting got worse. Last month, Marcus had thrown Rachel into the refrigerator hard enough to crack the plastic handle. She'd told the doctor she'd fallen down the stairs. The doctor had looked at her with something like pity, but he hadn't asked any questions, hadn't offered any help, had just written a prescription for pain pills and sent her home. Home to Marcus. Home to more of the same. Lily talked about the closet, how Marcus would lock her in when he was really angry, so she wouldn't see, so she couldn't be a witness. She talked about sitting in the dark for hours, listening to sounds she couldn't block out, praying to a God she wasn't sure existed, that her mother would still be alive when the door finally opened. She talked about the night 3 weeks ago when she thought her prayer hadn't been answered. Marcus had been drunker than usual, angrier than usual. Something about Rachel talking to a man at the grocery store. It didn't matter that the man had just been asking for directions. It didn't matter that Rachel had done nothing wrong. In Marcus's mind, she had betrayed him, and betrayal required punishment. Lily heard the first blow from her bedroom. She tried to run to her mother, but Marcus caught her in the hallway and threw her into the closet so hard that her head hit the shelf. She'd been dizzy for hours afterward. Maybe she'd passed out. She wasn't sure. When she finally came out, her mother was lying on the kitchen floor, not moving, not making any sound at all. Lily had shaken her for 10 minutes before Rachel's eyes had fluttered open. "I thought she was dead," Lily whispered, her voice finally cracking. "I thought he killed her, and I was going to be alone and no one would ever know what happened." Dominic's hands had curled into fists during her story. His knuckles were white. His jaw was clenched so tight that his teeth ached, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "What happened after that? Mama made me promise not to tell anyone. She said Marcus would kill us both if we tried to leave. She said there was nowhere we could go that he wouldn't find us. She said we just had to be good and not make him angry, and maybe it would get better." Lily looked up at Dominic with eyes that held no hope. "But it's not getting better. It's getting worse. Last night he said he was going to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. He hurt her so bad she couldn't get out of bed this morning. She told me to go to school, but I didn't go to school. I came here instead. Because you're the only one people are scared of." The words hung in the air between them. Dominic looked at this child who had figured out in 6 years what most adults never learned: that the systems designed to protect people often failed them, that calling the police didn't always help, that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to find a bigger monster. She had found the biggest one she could, and she was right to come. Dominic stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. His reflection stared back at him, and for a moment he saw the ghost of the 12-year-old boy who had once stood in a kitchen with a knife in his hand, choosing to become something terrible so that the people he loved could survive. "Lily," he said without turning around, "I want you to stay here tonight. You and your mama both. My wife is going to take care of you while I handle some things. Is that okay?" A small voice answered from behind him. "You're going to make him stop?" "Yes. Promise." Dominic turned to face her. His eyes held something that the men who worked for him would have recognized instantly. Something cold and certain and absolutely final. "I promise." And Dominic Caruso had never broken a promise in his life. The room fell silent after that. Elena appeared in the doorway with a look that asked 1,000 questions, but she only voiced one. "Rachel Brennan is here. Sal brought her 20 minutes ago. She's in the guest suite." Dominic nodded. "How bad?" Elena's face tightened. "Dr. Antonelli is with her now. She didn't want to come at first. She was terrified that Marcus would find out. Sal had to convince her that she was safer here than anywhere else in the world. He was right. She knows that now. But Dominic..." Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The things that man has done to her. The marks on her body. I've seen a lot in my years with you, but this is..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Dominic placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Take care of them. Both of them. Whatever they need, whatever it takes, they stay here until I say otherwise." "And Marcus Webb?" Dominic's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very, very cold. "Marcus Webb and I are going to have a conversation. A long one. And then Marcus Webb is going to disappear from this town forever." Elena didn't ask what that meant. After 30 years of marriage, she didn't have to. She simply nodded, squeezed his hand, and went back to caring for the broken women and children that her husband's darker work made possible to save. Dominic watched her go. Then he walked to his study, closed the door, and began making the phone calls that would set everything else in motion. By midnight, Rachel Brennan was asleep in a locked guest room with armed guards outside, and her daughter curled against her chest for the first time in months, without fear. By midnight, Marcus Webb had passed out drunk in his truck, parked outside an empty apartment, watched by men who would report his every move until Dominic was ready to act. By midnight, a doctor had documented injuries that told a story of systematic abuse spanning 8 months, evidence that would never see a courtroom but would serve a different kind of justice. And by midnight, Dominic Caruso sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of his mother that he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk. The photograph was old and faded, taken before the bruises became permanent, before the light left her eyes, before she became a ghost in her own home. She had died when Dominic was 17. Heart failure, the doctors had said. But he knew the truth. Her heart had failed because it had been broken too many times to keep beating. His father had killed her slowly, over years, with fists and words and the constant erosion of everything that made her human. Dominic had sworn on her grave that he would never let it happen again. Not to anyone. Not while he had the power to stop it. For 40 years, he had kept that promise in the shadows, quietly, efficiently, without recognition or reward. But this time would be different. This time, the whole town would know exactly what happened to men like Marcus Webb. This time, there would be witnesses. There would be whispers that spread like wildfire through every household. There would be a message so clear that no one could possibly misunderstand it. Hurt a child in Caruso territory. Touch a woman who can't defend herself. And discover what happens when the monster everyone fears decides to protect the innocent. Marcus Webb's fate was already sealed. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning arrived with the kind of pale winter sunlight that made everything look fragile. Frost clung to the windows of the Caruso mansion, and the gardens that had hosted a birthday party just yesterday now stood empty and silent, waiting for whatever came next. Dominic hadn't slept. He'd spent the hours before dawn reviewing everything his men had gathered. Marcus Webb's employment records, his rental history, his criminal background check, which showed 2 prior domestic violence charges in other states. Both dropped when the victims refused to testify. The pattern was clear. The evidence was damning. And none of it would ever matter in a court of law. But Dominic didn't operate in courts of law. He operated in a different kind of justice, the kind that didn't require lawyers or judges or juries, the kind that happened in back rooms and empty warehouses and the silent spaces where men discovered exactly how much pain a human body could endure. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Sal. Target awake, hungover, driving around town looking for them, making threats at every stop. Half the town has heard him by now. Dominic allowed himself a small, cold smile. Good. Let him dig his own grave. Let everyone see exactly what he is before I bury him in it. He stood and straightened his jacket, checking his reflection in the window. The man who looked back was calm, composed, and absolutely certain of what he was about to do. It was time to have a conversation with Marcus Webb. But first, he had one more thing to handle. He walked through the mansion to the guest suite where Rachel and Lily had spent the night. A guard stood outside the door, nodding respectfully as Dominic approached. The door was slightly open, and through the gap, he could hear soft voices. Elena, speaking in the gentle tones she used with frightened animals and broken people. Rachel, responding in whispers that trembled with exhaustion and residual fear. Dominic knocked lightly and pushed the door open. The scene inside made something twist in his chest. Rachel Brennan sat propped against the headboard, her face a map of purple and yellow bruises that makeup couldn't begin to hide. One eye was swollen nearly shut. Her lip was split in two places. Her arms, exposed by the short sleeves of a borrowed nightgown, showed defensive wounds in various stages of healing. She looked like she had lost a fight with a wild animal. In a way, she had. Lily sat beside her mother, small hand clasped tightly around Rachel's fingers, as if afraid that letting go might mean losing her forever. When she saw Dominic in the doorway, her face lit up with something that looked almost like hope. Mr. Caruso. Her voice was stronger than it had been yesterday. Is everything okay? Everything is fine, sweetheart. Dominic stepped into the room, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller. I just wanted to check on you and your mama before I handle some business. Rachel's good eye fixed on him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part gratitude, part fear, part something else that looked almost like shame. Mr. Caruso, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. Her voice was hoarse, probably from screaming. We don't have any way to repay you. I don't have any money saved. I can't. Stop. Dominic's voice was gentle but firm. You don't owe me anything, not a single thing. But you've done so much. The guards, the doctor, this room. I don't understand why. Because no one deserves what he did to you. Dominic moved closer, pulling a chair to the bedside and sitting down so he wasn't looming over her. Because your daughter walked 2 miles through town to find someone who could help. Because that kind of bravery deserves to be rewarded, not punished. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She tried to hold them back, but they spilled over anyway, running down her damaged face in streams that probably stung the cuts they crossed. I should have left months ago. I should have been stronger. I should have protected Lily instead of... You did protect her. Dominic's voice cut through her spiral. You took the beatings so he wouldn't touch her. You sent her to hide so she wouldn't have to watch. You survived every day so she would still have a mother. That's not weakness, Rachel. That's strength. She stared at him as if he was speaking a foreign language, as if no one had ever told her that her survival mattered, that her suffering meant something, that she had worth beyond being someone's victim. Dominic understood that look. He had seen it in his own mother's eyes years ago before the light went out completely. I'm going to tell you something, he said quietly. Something I don't tell many people. Rachel nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When I was 12 years old, my father beat my mother so badly she almost died. I stood between them with a knife and told him that if he ever touched her again, I would kill him. He left that night and never came back. The room was absolutely silent. I made a promise to myself then, that I would never stand by while someone hurt the innocent, that I would use whatever power I gained to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I've kept that promise for 40 years. He leaned forward, meeting Rachel's one good eye with an intensity that made her breath catch. Your daughter reminded me why I made that promise. She showed more courage yesterday than most grown men show in their entire lives. And she did it for you, because she loves you more than she fears anything else in this world. Rachel's face crumpled. She reached for Lily and pulled her close, burying her battered face in her daughter's hair. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I couldn't keep you safe. You did keep me safe, Mama. Lily's voice was muffled but clear. And now Mr. Caruso is going to help. He promised. Dominic stood, giving them space for their tears. I need to ask you something, Rachel. and I need you to tell me the truth." She looked up, fear flickering across her features. "What Marcus has done to you and Lily? Is it enough? I don't understand. I mean, is what I already know enough, or is there more? Things you haven't told anyone. Things you think are too shameful or too terrible to speak out loud." Rachel's face went pale beneath the bruises. Her eyes darted to Lily, then back to Dominic. "She knows," Elena said softly from her chair by the window. "She's heard everything. There's nothing you can tell us that would be worse than what she's already lived through." Rachel closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The shame was still there, but underneath it was a flicker of something else. Rage. "He made me do things," she whispered. "Things I can't even say in front of her. And when I wouldn't, or when I cried, he said he'd start doing them to Lily instead. That's why I stayed. That's why I didn't leave. Because I was afraid if I tried to run, he'd—" Her voice broke completely. Dominic's hands curled into fists at his sides. The rage that had been simmering since yesterday began to boil, white-hot and merciless. "Thank you for telling me." His voice was steady, but his eyes had gone flat and cold. "That's all I needed to know." He turned and walked toward the door. "Mr. Caruso?" Rachel's voice stopped him. "What are you going to do?" Dominic paused with his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "I'm going to make sure Marcus Webb never hurts anyone ever again." The words hung in the air like a promise, like a threat, like a sentence that had already been passed by a court that recognized no appeal. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving behind a woman and child who were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into the protection of something far more powerful than they had ever imagined, and far more dangerous to anyone who crossed it. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the frost and flooding the town with the kind of light that revealed every secret and shadow. Dominic stood on his front porch, watching two black sedans pull up the driveway, his men emerging with the quiet efficiency of soldiers preparing for war. Sal approached first, his weathered face carrying news that he knew his boss wanted to hear. "Target is at Millie's Diner. Been there for about an hour. Still asking everyone if they've seen Rachel. Still making threats." The waitress called her husband, who called Tony, who confirmed Webb is getting more agitated by the minute. Dominic nodded slowly. "Good. Here's what's going to happen." He laid out the plan in quiet, precise terms, the kind of plan that left nothing to chance and everything to justice. Within the hour, Marcus Webb would discover that his hunting had come to an end, and the hunted had become the hunter. The drive to Millie's Diner took 12 minutes. Dominic spent them in silence, watching the town scroll past his window. The streets he had protected for decades. The businesses that paid their respects. The families that went about their lives never knowing how much darkness he kept at bay. This town was his responsibility. These people were under his protection, and Marcus Webb had violated both in ways that demanded an answer. The diner came into view, a chrome and glass relic from another era that had somehow survived into the present. Through the windows, Dominic could see the morning crowd. Workers grabbing coffee before their shifts. Retirees arguing about politics. Mothers corralling children who would rather be anywhere else. And at the counter, nursing what looked like his third cup of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, sat Marcus Webb. Dominic studied him for a long moment. Stocky build, maybe 5'11", the kind of man who looked strong enough to intimidate women and children, but who would crumble like wet paper against anyone his own size. His face was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes rumpled from sleeping in his truck. He looked exactly like what he was, a coward who only felt powerful when his victims couldn't fight back. Dominic stepped out of the sedan. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of bacon and coffee from the diner's open windows. A few pedestrians noticed the black car and its well-dressed occupant, then quickly found somewhere else to look. Word traveled fast in small towns. Everyone knew whose car that was. Dominic straightened his jacket and walked toward the entrance. Inside the diner, the bell above the door chimed his arrival. Conversations faltered. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The waitress behind the counter, a woman named Betty who had worked there for 30 years, looked up with an expression that mixed surprise with dawning understanding. She knew who Dominic Caruso was. She knew why he might be here. And from the way her eyes darted to Marcus Webb at the counter, she had a very good idea what was about to happen. Dominic ignored the stares. He walked to the counter with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once had to rush in his life. He chose the stool 2 seats away from Marcus Webb, settled onto it, and signaled Betty with a small nod. Coffee, black. She poured it with steady hands, though her eyes kept flickering between Dominic and the man beside him. The rest of the diner had gone absolutely silent. Even the children had stopped fidgeting, sensing something in the air that their parents understood all too well. Marcus Webb looked up from his coffee and did a double take. "Mr. Caruso?" His voice cracked slightly, surprise mixing with the hangover that was clearly splitting his skull. "I didn't expect to see you here. Is everything okay at the job sites? I was going to come in today, but I've got some personal stuff going on." Dominic took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't look at Marcus, didn't acknowledge the nervous babbling, just sat in perfect stillness, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "Personal stuff," he said finally. His voice carried through the quiet diner with perfect clarity. "Tell me about this personal stuff, Marcus." "It's nothing, really. Just my girlfriend. She took off last night with her kid. Didn't say where she was going. I've been looking for them all morning." "Took off?" Dominic set his coffee down with a soft click. "That's interesting, because I heard a different version of events." Marcus's face went pale. "Different version? I don't know what you mean. I heard that your girlfriend didn't take off. I heard that she was removed from a dangerous situation. I heard that she's currently recovering from injuries that no woman should ever have to survive." Dominic turned on his stool, finally facing Marcus directly. His dark eyes held nothing but cold certainty. "I heard that you've been beating her for months, that you've been terrorizing her daughter, that you lock a 6-year-old child in a closet while you use her mother as a punching bag." The diner had gone so quiet that Dominic could hear his own heartbeat. "That's not—" Marcus stammered, his face flushing red. "Whatever she told you, she's lying. She's always making things up to get sympathy. You know how women are." "I know exactly how women are," Dominic interrupted. His voice hadn't risen, but somehow it felt louder than a shout. "I know that they're strong enough to survive things that would break most men. I know that they're brave enough to protect their children even when they can't protect themselves. And I know that men who hurt them are the lowest form of coward in existence." Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "I also know," Dominic continued, "that you work for me, that you wear my company's name on your back, that everything you've done while taking my paycheck and enjoying my protection." He leaned slightly closer. "Did you think that would save you, Marcus? Did you think that being one of my employees meant you could do whatever you wanted to whoever you wanted? Look, Mr. Caruso, I don't know what she told you, but she didn't tell me anything. Dominic's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Her daughter did. A 6-year-old girl walked 2 miles to find someone who could make you stop. She found me. All the color drained from Marcus's face. That little bitch, he breathed. I told Rachel to keep her quiet. I told her. He never finished the sentence. Dominic's hand moved faster than anyone could track. One moment, he was sitting calmly on his stool. The next, his fingers were wrapped around Marcus's throat, not squeezing, just holding him in place with the casual ease of a man who had done this many times before. The diner erupted in gasps and shuffling as patrons tried to decide whether to run or stay. Betty grabbed the phone behind the counter, then slowly set it down again. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't her place to interfere. Let me be very clear about something, Dominic said, his voice still eerily calm. You're going to walk out of this diner with me. You're going to get into my car without making a scene. And then you and I are going to have a much longer conversation somewhere more private. He released Marcus's throat and stood up, straightening his jacket as if nothing had happened. If you try to run, my men will catch you before you reach the door. If you make a scene, everyone in this town will know exactly what you are before sunset. If you fight back, Dominic smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Please, fight back. I would genuinely enjoy that. Marcus looked around the diner, searching for an ally, a defender, anyone who might intervene on his behalf. But every face that met his gaze looked away. These people knew who Dominic Caruso was. They knew what he did to men who crossed him. And from what they had just heard, they knew exactly why Marcus Webb deserved whatever was coming. No one was going to help him. No one was even going to remember seeing him. Marcus Webb stood on shaking legs and followed Dominic Caruso out of the diner, watched by 24 witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened next. The answer was simple. Justice. The kind that didn't require courtrooms or lawyers or the slow grinding machinery of a system that too often failed the people it was supposed to protect. The kind that happened in the spaces between laws. The kind that Dominic Caruso had been delivering for 40 years. The black sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared down Main Street, carrying its passenger toward a reckoning that had been building since the first time he raised his hand against an innocent woman. Behind them, the town began to whisper, and the whispers would grow into stories that parents told their children for generations. About the birthday party, about the little girl who was brave enough to ask for help, about the man who was powerful enough to answer, about what happened to monsters in Caruso territory, and about why no one who heard those stories would ever forget them. 6 months later, Lily Brennan walked through the same gardens where she had once whispered her desperate plea to a stranger. But everything was different now. The gardens were blooming with spring flowers, tulips and daffodils painting the grounds in colors that seemed too bright to be real. The fountain splashed in the afternoon sunlight, its sound mixing with the laughter of children playing on the lawn. And Lily herself was different. Healthy weight on her small frame, clean clothes that actually fit, a smile that reached her eyes instead of stopping at her mouth. She was playing with Sophia Caruso, Dominic's granddaughter, the two of them chasing each other around the garden with the kind of carefree joy that Lily had almost forgotten existed. They were the same age. They liked the same games. And somewhere over the past 6 months, they had become something like sisters. Rachel Brennan watched from the patio, a cup of tea warming her hands. The bruises were gone now, healed completely. leaving behind nothing but memories that would fade in time. She had put on weight. Her hair was clean and styled. She wore new clothes, bought with money from a job that paid a living wage and didn't require her to be on her feet for 12 hours at a time. Dominic had made a call, just one. And suddenly, there was a position available at a local law office, entry-level but with room for advancement, perfect for someone who was taking night classes to become a paralegal. Rachel hadn't wanted charity, but this wasn't charity, Elena had explained gently. This was family taking care of family. And somehow, impossibly, that's what they had become. Every Sunday, Rachel and Lily came to the Caruso estate for dinner. They sat at the long table in the formal dining room, surrounded by Dominic's children and grandchildren, passing dishes and telling stories and laughing at jokes that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months ago. Lily called Elena Nonna now. She called Dominic's daughter Aunt Teresa. She called the estate her second home, and no one corrected her because no one wanted to. Dominic watched his extended family from his seat at the head of the table, and sometimes he wondered if this was what his mother had wanted for him all along. Not the empire, not the power, not the fear that kept enemies at bay and allies in line. Just this. Family dinners with people who loved each other. Children laughing in gardens where nothing bad could touch them. A legacy of protection instead of pain. Marcus Webb was gone now. The official story was that he had accepted a job opportunity several states away, so far away that no one expected him to ever return. The unofficial story was whispered in certain circles, told in coded language that protected both the speaker and the listener. No one asked for details. No one wanted them. All that mattered was that he was gone, and he was never coming back. That Rachel and Lily were safe. That justice had been served in the only way that truly mattered. On this particular Sunday, after dinner had been cleared and the adults were enjoying coffee and conversation, Lily approached Dominic with something hidden behind her back. "Mr. Caruso?" Her voice was still soft, but it didn't shake anymore. "I made something for you." She held out a piece of paper, a drawing, done in crayon with the careful intensity of a 6-year-old artist. It showed a big figure in a black suit standing next to a small figure in a yellow dress. The big figure was holding a shield, protecting the small figure from a dark cloud that loomed in the background. At the top, in letters that wobbled but were clearly legible, she had written, "My hero." Dominic stared at the drawing for a long moment. In 40 years of building empires and destroying enemies, no one had ever called him a hero. In 40 years of keeping promises and delivering justice, no one had ever given him a gift that meant anything at all. He looked up at Lily, at this brave little girl who had changed everything by simply asking for help, and felt the walls around his heart crack open a little wider. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Thank you, Lily. I'm going to hang it in my study where I can see it every day." Her face lit up. "Really? Really?" She threw her arms around his neck in a hug that caught him completely off guard. He froze for a moment, unused to affection that wasn't from his immediate family. Then, slowly, carefully, he hugged her back. Elena watched from across the room with tears in her eyes. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Dominic sat alone in his study. The drawing was already framed and hanging on the wall, positioned next to the faded photograph of his mother and a more recent picture of his sister and her children. His family, all of them, the ones who shared his blood, and the ones who had earned their place in his heart through courage, and circumstance. He thought about the boy he had been, hiding in closets and listening to his mother scream. He thought about the promises he had made and the dark things he had done to keep them. He thought about all the years of building walls around his heart, convinced that softness was weakness and vulnerability was death. And then he thought about Lily, about her tiny hand tugging at his sleeve, about her whispered plea that had shattered through every defense he had ever built, about the way she had looked at him with complete trust, believing with a child's absolute faith that he could make the monster stop. She had been right. He had made the monster stop. And in doing so, he had remembered something he had almost forgotten. That the real measure of power wasn't how many people feared you. It was how many people you could protect. It was how many lives you could change with a single act of kindness. It was how many children could sleep peacefully at night because you had made the darkness go away. Dominic looked at the drawing one more time. My hero. For the first time in 40 years, he let himself believe it might be true. Somewhere in town, a mother and daughter were sleeping peacefully in an apartment with good locks and no fear. Somewhere in the police department, new protocols were being implemented that would actually help victims instead of sending them back to their abusers. Somewhere in whispered conversations at diners and barbershops and church basements, people were telling the story of what Dominic Caruso had done and why. The monster who protected the innocent. The killer who saved the broken. The most feared man in 3 counties who had knelt in the grass at a children's birthday party to listen to a 6-year-old girl's desperate plea. Some stories become legends. This one became a promise that no child would ever have to walk 2 miles alone to find someone brave enough to help them. That no woman would ever have to choose between her own survival and her daughter's safety. That hurt a child in this territory, and the consequences would be swift, certain, and absolute. Dominic Caruso stood and walked to his window, looking out at the gardens where his granddaughter played, where Lily laughed, where the future was growing in the sunlight without any shadows to dim it. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest power to change everything. A little girl had taught him that, and he would never forget it. Thanks for watching. If you believe every child deserves someone brave enough to protect them, hit that subscribe button. And remember to share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes the people who seem the most frightening are the ones most willing to fight for those who can't fight for themselves.